Thank you very much for coming. My name's John Stewart. I normally start with an apology. I'm the BBC's John Stewart, so if you're expecting Comedy Central's John Stewart, I might be a letdown. He's the more attractive, funnier version of us. But the panelists are definitely not going to be a disappointment. We've got two amazing guys here today, and we're going to talk about mobile technologies. Are they going to revolutionize the way that we travel? And the premise here is that information could actually make our commutes, our lives in cities much easier. The information superhighway meets the regular highway, I guess. Right. So let me go straight on and introduce you guys first of all, just so that you know who we all are. First of all, David Alpert is the man behind the blog Greater Washington. And your aim is really to improve the city that you live in, right?
Exactly.
And David, before that, you were at Google. And you've lived in, I've got here, Boston, San Francisco, New York, in addition to Washington, D.C., so plenty of city experience as well.
Exactly.
And Yusuf, you're the CEO of Streetline.
Yep.
Streetline is a global leader in this smart city technology. You're actually out there deploying some of these sensors that are being used, hopefully, to make our lives easier. And the way that most of us, or some of us, may have interacted with you and your product is an app called Parker, which we'll get to a little bit more as we go through. But let me get you both just to tell us a little bit more about yourselves on top of what I already said, just so we can get a kind of a feel for where each of you come from. David, why don't you go first, as you've got some stuff on the board there behind you. Tell us a bit about your blog.
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone, for being here. I run the website Greater Washington, greaterwashington.org, which is all about the way the shape and form of the city, in this case, the Washington, D.C. and its surrounding area, are changing and evolving, especially how people get around, the way communities look, like where there are buildings and where there is retail and so forth. But transportation is a very important part of that, because there are so many different ways people get around in Washington and in all other cities. We, Washington, have been something of an incubator for a number of different companies and innovative ways for people to travel. For example, we've been among the earliest cities to have a number of different systems that people can use to get around. Someone going from one neighborhood to another has so many different options and choices for how they do that. They could walk, they could take a personal bicycle, they could use bike sharing, where we were one of for a long time, the largest city with the largest bike sharing system in the nation. This is our bike sharing system, which is the same technology as the one right outside here in Aspen that Aspen launched 2 weeks ago. You can take a taxi. You could call a taxi with Uber, or use a black car with Uber, or you can call a taxi with a number of different apps that have launched. You can take Zipcar. You can take Car2Go, which is a point-to-point car sharing technology. You can drive in your own personal car, and so on and so on. So people have all of these different choices for ways to get around. And we talk about all of them and talk about how people are making the trade-offs between different choices, how these choices are helping different groups of people get where they need to be, and also the thing we're going to talk about in this session, how people are able to find information that they need to understand which of these choices should they make. Should they try taking bike share, or will they find that there aren't any bikes available? Should they try to take Car2Go, or will they find that there aren't cars available? What about the bus? Is there going to be a bus coming? What if you're going to a neighborhood you're not that familiar with? What is the right bus route? And if you stand at the side of the road, will the bus even show up? And will you know that you're standing in the right place? All of these different choices that people are trying to make help enrich people's lives, help people give more choices, help make, in many ways, urban living work better for people depending on where they work and where they live. But in order to make them all happen, we can ease that process with good technology. And we'll talk a little bit more about that.
So it's really a lot of information that people potentially have at their disposal, but they've got to kind of find a way to interact with, which, Zia, is what you've been working on. Of course, another transport option we didn't really mention was people could take their cars, right, but then they'd have to park when they get there. So tell us about what you're doing.
So, as John mentioned, I run a company called Streetline, which, believe it or not, is in the smart parking business. I've wanted to be in parking since I was 3. No, that's not. So I joined Streetline about 3 years ago, and there were kind of 3 macro trends that led me and my colleagues at Streetline to kind of focus in on this area. The first one was this whole topic of the Internet of Things. This is where sensors are becoming cheap enough and good enough And you heard yesterday Tony Fadell of Nest talk about how he got into the space of reinventing thermostats, which is another, you wouldn't think about somebody that's been at Apple going and saying, okay, I'm going to attack the thermostat business. And I was on the leadership team of a large software company called SAP, and nobody expected me to go into the parking business. But the sensors are becoming very ubiquitous across the landscape, and especially in a smart city context, and we'll talk later, I think, about other sensing technologies. So the Internet of Things was one driver to this. The second was obviously mobile technologies, where information can now go out to you as a consumer, whether it's on a mobile phone or in our case, importantly, in the car, where cars become connected. And the third piece of the puzzle was certainly this aspect of the parking industry itself. It's an industry that hasn't changed in the last 40 years. You still find a parking spot the same way. In a lot of places still you're using coin-operated meters. Still 50% plus of the meter options are coin-operated. Now they've transitioned a little bit to credit card, and in some places mobile payments. Parking issues are estimated to cost about 30% of the traffic in a city. And this is studies that have been done by UCLA and other places. And you think about it this way, and then you can relate to it from a personal perspective. All these map apps will tell you, it takes 14.2 minutes to go from point A to point B. The problem is point B is not your ultimate destination. You can't just leave your car at a restaurant or business saying, I'm here, I'm leaving now. You actually have to park your car. And that's point C, where you actually park your car. And it's that second piece of the puzzle that nobody looked at. And there was no data or information to inform that. Parking revenues are typically the second or third largest source of revenue for a city. So it's a major driver of revenue other than taxes. And they take up inordinate amount of real estate in a city environment. In New York City, there's apparently 13 Central Parks worth of parking space in New York City, which is truly incredible. So what we do is we go out and put out sensors in the ground in each parking spot. There's a mesh network that goes on top of it. The sensors detect the presence of a car through a magnetometer and a light sensor. That data then goes to a series of applications, both for the city, so we help them on analytics, things like dynamic pricing to rethink how you manage parking and optimize the economics of parking. They go to merchants and businesses so they can embed real-time data on their websites to see where the open parking spots are on the street. And it also goes to the consumer. And you can download an app called Parker on iPhone and Android. That will tell you exactly where the open parking spots are in real time. And in the spirit of show and tell, so I'm actually going to show that to you. So this is, and sorry, this is just an iPad here. So you can go in and you can look at the range of different cities in which we have deployments, and where it's 4+, it says we have as well as real-time sensors. And I just picked LA here, and it says there's 2,691 parking spots available this very second in downtown LA. And you click on that, it opens up, and you see these different categories. And we've broken them up into these three categories: less than 2, 2+, and 4+. And that's kind of the key to this. We looked at various ways that you could engage with consumers. And so the basic idea here is when you get to an intersection, you have three choices. You can turn left, you can turn right, you can go straight. And you may argue with your spouses, your girlfriends, boyfriends, and so we help marriages as well. And you can say, well, I'm going to take a left. If you see here that taking a left gets you to a block with less than 2, you may not want to do that. You may still find something, but unlikely. If you turn to a block with 2+ or 4+, you're guaranteed to find parking. Now, even though we know the exact location of the spot, we won't send you to that exact location because real life interferes with it, somebody else may come in and so on. So they've instead, this can take your time to find parking and reduce it dramatically to a couple of minutes. So this is just one example of how we can essentially have cities talk to us in a way that we've never been able to do before. Parking has become kind of one of those killer apps because it impacts all of us pretty profoundly, and as well impacts how the city manages its resources and so on.
And it's a big revenue generator as well. So I guess it's a really useful one to start this idea of the smart city with, because you've got this kind of business model built in at the beginning of how it's going to be paid for.
Yeah, as I said, parking revenues are a very high source of revenue, and the way we look at it is really the economics of a single parking spot. And there's two sources of revenue for that. So one is the money that you pay to rent that spot, which is the money you put into the meter, and the other, unfortunately, is the money you pay if you don't pay the first time around, and that's the ticket. And so both of those can be optimized in a manner. So LA, for example, is doing dynamic pricing. They take all our data, and you'll be able to see, the prices could range from $1 to $4. So you can hit price here. It now shows you, actually, this is a good example. It's $4 on this blue dot, $3 here, and $2 down the street.
To park at a meter in the street.
To park at the meter on the street. So this is what LA is now doing. And that's never happened before. I mean, historically, it was a flat fee, $1 per hour, no matter what time of day, no matter where you are, and maybe Saturday and Sunday was free. And that's a very inefficient use of the real estate, actually, and the economic resources.
But in order to get this up and running, and I work in Hollywood, so I've actually been able to try this app because you work in the blocks around our office. And it's great.
Work?
Yeah, you run it on your smartphone, and you get the information. I mean, I suppose the one thing you have to do is pull your smartphone out of your pocket and hold it when you're driving, which is discouraged these days.
Yeah, it's voice enabled now, so you can just kind of put it up there. And we're working now with a range of automotive companies, honestly, because this belongs in in-car navigation. And you put in your address, and as you get closer to your destination, it will show you the available parking spots both on the street and in garages. And then you can layer on a range of services, reservations of spots. There's mobile payments are integrated into this involved. So it's about rethinking and reimagining a vertical and industry that has such profound implications for all of us that drive as well as the cities.
And in order to do this, in order to make the city smarter, you've actually had to go out and install a range of sensors and a network to link them up. David, I mean, this isn't the only source of information that we have in a modern city, though, is it? We have a lot.
That's right. We have more and more, every transportation system is connected to data sources that help people understand how to use that, whether in parking, it's sensors. In transit, it's real-time locations of vehicles. In bike sharing, it's that the stations themselves report to a central server where how many bikes there are and how many open docks there are. The car sharing systems all know the locations of their vehicles and so forth. They're all developing apps. There are apps now. There are websites. There are web tools. One of the challenges that we will be facing with going forward with a lot of these cities that have multiple different systems is how to put them together and how to help people choose among and navigate between all of these choices. And a big part of that is for the agencies or companies that are running these systems to make the data available for people that are building their own apps, people that are building apps that integrate multiple different types of data, people that are building all kinds of services layered on top of the agency's services themselves. Let me give you a couple examples. I talked before about bike sharing. Our system, one just launched in Chicago, one launched here in Aspen 2 weeks ago. This is a website that somebody built based on the data available from Capital Bike Share. And you probably can't see a lot of detail, but you can see all of these little pie charts that are stuck into the map with pins. Those show at the particular moment I took this screenshot how many bikes are available, that is the red area, and empty docks, the gray area, in each station. So if you are going around the city or at your desk and you want to go take a bike, you can look and see where are there stations available, where are there bikes available. This person was able to build this entirely without having to get the permission of Capital Bike Share at all, because there is a data feed in an XML format that is published by each of the bike systems that use this Bixby-based technology, like ours, Chicago's, Aspen's, and many other cities. In fact, he was able to make the same system work in many other cities as soon as they launched a lot of their bike sharing systems, because he was able to just automatically import the same data feed from a different city and build the same type of thing. Capital Bike Share went even further, and it decided to release data at the request of some folks, myself and a number of other people, who said, why don't you release anonymous trip data? List of trips that said bike number 123 left station 12 and at 2:25 p.m. and it got to station 21 at 2:41 p.m. or whatever. And they only had that data. It was completely anonymous, so you didn't know who it was. You didn't know if that same person then took another trip later. You couldn't connect it at all, so there was no privacy issue there. It did tell you if people were long-term members or short-term members, so you could differentiate sort of the tourists from the kind of people that subscribe for the whole year. This data also they released completely publicly, and people were able to build all kinds of tools like this one. This one shows you could click on any station and see sort of the flow of where do people ride to and from this particular neighborhood from elsewhere. And are they unbalanced? Do people ride more uphill or downhill? Do they tend to ride more to one area and then take the metro the other area? People were able to do all sorts of analyses, like on rainy days, do people take the use biking less or not? What makes more of a difference, cold or early, getting dark early, or rain? What about weekends versus weekdays? There were so many different analyses people were able to do, all of them without having to go negotiate with the Capital Bike Share lawyers and say, I want to analyze whether rain or darkness makes people less likely to bike. And that those folks didn't then say, okay, well, you should pay us $2,000 to compute that or whatever. But not all agencies had that sort of an attitude towards data. The transit system in DC, WMATA or Metro, actually in 2009 was asked by a number of folks involved with our blog to release similar types of data, to release even just files of all of their schedules and routes so that people could build trip planners, make maps of the routes, do visualizations of different types of where the buses are, where they go. People have made all kinds of neat videos of showing in some different cities. There's now one for DC because they eventually released the data, showing all these little dots moving around. And at the morning rush hour, all of a sudden the dots are all like going back and forth really fast, and then in the middle of the day it slows down. All sorts of things like that. But they said, actually, we're not sure we want to release this data because we, Metro, have this data and maybe it's valuable. I mean, if some people want it, then maybe they should pay for it. And one of the companies that wants it is Google. Google built a trip planning system, Google Transit, on top of Google Maps, went to a lot of transit agencies and said, if you give us your data, we will give you a free trip planner. And a lot of small agencies said, wow, that's a great deal because we didn't have the money to build a trip planner. WMATA had built its own trip planner at somewhat considerable expense a few years before, with a consultant had built it for them. And so they said, well, we have our own trip planner, so why should we have this data out there for anyone else? Even though the reasons people would use it was not only to do all these neat visualizations, but also to build mobile apps that let people see when the bus is coming, because at that time, the agency didn't have one. Or to integrate those apps with all the other bus systems in the region, because we have a lot of different bus systems. So they had a lot of debate about it, and eventually did ultimately agree to release the data. And they decided that it was, in fact, in their best interest not to try to make everybody pay, but rather to put it out there so that they would get more apps, more tools, more people using transit, which of course is their ultimate goal. They had a lot of reasons, which I don't need to go into a lot of detail, but maybe they wanted to control the whole experience end to end. Because what if someone built an app and it was bad? Then maybe people would blame the agency. Or what if the data was wrong?
Maybe we can actually ask Zia, you've got first-hand experience of this. You're the man who owns some of this data. Do you release it widely, openly, freely?
Yeah, so look, there's for companies building these systems, there's a cost associated with building it, right? And you have to make up that cost in some shape or form. So either the city pays for it, and then there's a certain way you can look at data, or we may go provide the sensors at no cost, and then you monetize the data in a different way. So there's a variety of different ways to look at it. I mean, if you look at the bike share plan in New York, and Gabe talked about it yesterday, where they went and every bike is a city bike, right? So they made the decision to balance the cost of deploying the system and putting Citibank's logo on it. Well, you could say, well, why do you put their logo on it? But it's an economic decision.
So ultimately, it comes down to money. Somebody somewhere.
Well, yeah. I mean, if somebody provides a service, startups or any other company don't do this for free. So now we do make our data available. And again, I'll give you an example here. So there's this B Street Books Parker Map. I showed you Parker, the app before. We have a free API called Parker Map, where any business can embed that real-time data onto their website. So this is just one example. I just pulled it up. It's B Street Books. It's a bookstore in San Mateo. And you see they've got the Parker logo there. And then when you go to their map, this is their map on their website. They have the live real-time data of available parking spots around their business.
But they pay you for that?
No, that's the city. We did it through the city, and it's a service that they can utilize. There's no payment involved. And for them to put this on their website, it's literally a 2 to 3 minute exercise for them. Anybody who manages their website can do this. So this is about, you have to get the data out in a way that makes sense, in a way that appropriately compensates the organization and it's a partnership with the city to figure out what's the right business model.
David, in your experience, is that happening, and is it happening sort of consistently and across cities, across business partners, or is it a bit piecemeal at the moment?
Yeah, it varies greatly. It depends on the model that the city has worked out with the vendor and the agency. So sometimes, as you were saying, the city is just paying a vendor for, if you pay someone to pave the street, they're not involved then in who's driving or biking on that street, right? They're kind of the involvement ends. Some of these other newer types of transportation are going to have much more long-term involvement with the company. A car sharing system, the city's not going to say there's a contract for a car sharing system and then the company is going to go away. They're going to run the car sharing system. So does that company then offer its data feed? Here on the screen you can see an example of a screen that some folks developed in DC. This is in a coffee shop, and we also want to have some of them in the windows of stores. These screens integrate information from the bus, and this shows multiple bus systems. The sort of orange, the teal ones are one county's bus system, and the blue ones are a different bus system, for example. And it also has the Capital Bike Share. You can see there on the right with a little pie chart. These could also show things like, are there zip cars and car-to-goes nearby? Are there how long will it take for you to get an Uber if you called one? All sorts of questions like that. Right now, that's not so much the way it's working because these are the kind of publicly run systems. Then the privately run system is a little different. But hopefully all of these can integrate over time.
So I think, John, one thing which needs to be looked at much more interesting enough is the business models and the relationship between the cities and all these new technologies that are coming into place. I think our public officials, and it is happening, and it's the mayors that are going out and rethinking their cities. And by the way, I think the cities level is the most interesting part of the public sector today. It's not the federal government, it's not the state, it's the cities where this action is happening. But they have to look at who is providing the service. What is a public service? What can be provided as a private service? How can you rethink how those things come together? And I don't think it's the traditional model of, you pay for this, you procure this, there's an RFP, et cetera, et cetera.
Here's a contract. Yeah.
You have to be open and thoughtful about it. But there are so many more technologies that are coming into play, sensors, mobile apps, and so on, that may completely change how a citizen interacts with that city. And that requires a much more proactive and a much more nimble approach by the cities in order to engage with those things. Go spend $20,000 on a pilot, go spend $20,000 on 3 pilots and see how it goes. And pick the one that makes sense and so on.
And we're just going to have to make sure that on the one hand there's good profit opportunity for the companies involved and they can grow their business. On the other hand, that city governments have an interest in not getting locked in to a particular type of technology that then only one company runs and then they have to wholesale. It might depend. With sensors, probably the sensors aren't going to last forever anyway, and so it's, but with some types of things, these systems can last. Our metro system's replacing its fare gates. They're 30 plus years old, so it's been working with this vendor for that whole time. How can they structure their next version of all of that so that they can buy a bunch of fare gates and then, if that company goes out of business, then they don't have to buy all new fare gates?
Because it's this need to be flexible and this need to share and be open that perhaps our governments aren't particularly good at in general.
But I think the city governments are getting there. I really do. I spend a lot of time with mayors and heads of transportations, across. I think at the city level, they're being kind of left to their own devices and they're becoming much more creative on how to solve the problems and realizing that it's an easier process. So it sometimes does become frustrating because it's unpredictable and may take longer than you'd want, especially for a startup. But we have, IBM, Siemens, Cisco, Citibank, all helping us in that engagement, which is fine then.
Because there is an issue perhaps with the infrastructure, you touched on it, what happens if you do go out and install all these sensors and then in 10, 20 years time, your business has changed or whatever, the contract's awarded to somebody else, I don't know, do you still own the sensors? Do they get handed to the next person?
For me, long term is 1 year, forget about 10, 20 years.
Right.
Who the hell knows what's going to happen in 10, 20 years?
But when we're planning a city, that's how we need to be thinking, perhaps even longer term.
I would disagree with that, right? It depends depends on what aspect, right? So if you lay out a train infrastructure, then obviously you want it to last for 10, 20 years. Our sensors last 4.5 to 5 years on 2 AA batteries. We could have optimized the batteries for 10 years, but we didn't do it because in 5 years, the sensors are going to get cheaper and they're going to get better and they're going to get smaller. And so we do a renewal and remove it and you're off and running. More and more of these services are based on software. I mean, long term is next week, not 3 years from now. And so I think the mechanics of that decision making, now infrastructure, bridges, roads, different. But when you start taking a look at software and the connection of software to the physical infrastructure, which is this whole topic of the Internet of Things, the metrics change dramatically.
And we can be more flexible. I mean, David, is
have
that
to be.
the way things are likely to go, in your opinion?
I think that's right. It's going to, I mean, look, with, for example, with bike sharing systems, the new ones, again, like the Aspen one, allow the operators to move the stations around just with a truck that, a crane or a truck with a big lifter thing, I don't know. They can move the stations around with the right kind of equipment that drives around on wheels. The previous one that we had in Washington, D.C. was a different system called Smart Bike that was actually installed under the ground. And as in it had power and network connections. Hardwired. So in order to move those, it would cost, Gabe Klein can say what it would have been to move one of those, $70,000. Right, and so you'd have to get permissions from all the utilities and shut down maybe roads or sidewalk, all of this stuff. So more flexibility allows more innovation for sure.
Another issue that people sometimes raise when we start talking about smart cities, connected cities, covering our cities in sensors is one of privacy. I mean, you gave some examples of the type of data you're able to mine out of bike sharing. And I mean, presumably I'm sharing information with you about where I'm choosing to park my car and therefore where I am each day and things. Are there issues around privacy that we need to be aware of or thinking about?
Yeah, we need to talk about that 10 p.m. trip you made last night. So I think that there's two topics here. One is that from our side, our sensors just detect the presence of a car. We have no idea which car, and we certainly don't know whose car. I mean, it's essentially a hunk of metal over a magnetometer and a light sensor. So then we don't collect anything from the mobile app. So that's one answer in terms of our current business. I think the other answer is there's a generational view on privacy, which has a significant impact. If you talk to people in their 20s, 30s, and even some in their early 40s, you could argue, given up on privacy in a sense, or they're willing to trade off access to their information and what they do. I mean, you look at what people post and so on. So there is just a fundamentally different view on privacy. Now, having said that, I think in the area of the Internet of Things, where people are interacting with physical things, whether it's bikes or buses or roads or trains or whatever, you are going to be collecting different types of data that has never been collected before. People talk about big data, that's great. I'm more interested in new data. There's a whole new slew of data coming into the market, if you will, and there certainly could be some privacy issues there. Your smart meter is much more attuned to how you utilize energy. Your Nest
in your home,
in your home and so on. I mean, and if people can hack into the CIA or Defense Department databases, they can hack into your iPhone app to see what you're doing with the energy. But do you really care?
I don't know, David, is that the price we just have to pay to be able to get around our cities easily in future?
The privilege, not the price.
Paying with your privacy.
But you're assuming that that's a payment, and I'm just.
It's worth something to somebody, probably, that information.
And I'm just saying that there may be a generational difference in what somebody values that at. So for somebody that is younger, it may not be a price they're paying. It just may be, I don't care, I've never thought about it. Car sharing is another example. I mean, people, generation older than me would be, what do you mean I'm just going to go stand on the street and somebody's going to be driving by and I'm going to get into their car and, we'll discuss the weather. Now it's like, hey, no problem. So it's a different metric.
Do you see that?
I mean, yes, I think that people, Dee's absolutely right that there's something of a generational difference, though I think that a lot of people who are more willing to share the information then have some trigger at which they are really uncomfortable with it if the data gets used in a certain way, and they don't necessarily, they may feel more power to kind of stop it if that sort of thing happens. Like they feel like, well, if it gets really bad, I can shame that company on Twitter enough and maybe it'll stop. And so you don't need a law. But there does come a point for everyone, and this was, Tim Wu was talking about this yesterday at the session about privacy, that different people have all of these different thresholds for when they get nervous. And sometimes it's just that people don't know what's being done with the data. So maybe the car sharing company is actually selling the data to a data broker who is, using it to merge it with a database from CVS, and then who knows what happens. And people just don't know about that. And if people found out, as we sort of saw with some of the things going on with the NSA, they might get very angry. So I think that it's right that people are willing to, they'd rather get these benefits, and they're okay with companies knowing what is happening. But I think it's always like a little bit of a minefield, that all of a sudden a company might step on a mine and then get enormous bad publicity, and that's tricky. For a big company like Facebook, they just have gotten in the habit of stepping on these mines all the time, and they just blow up, and they're just like so big it doesn't matter. But smaller companies is not necessarily going to be the same situation.
So we've talked about a lot of the challenges involved here, but I started the session by saying that perhaps the future of our transport is our mobile phones in our hands. So what is your view of the future? Maybe the utopian. I know you only want to look 1 year ahead. David, you can go a bit further.
1 year is also no. Look, I actually think the mobile phone is the most profound innovation for transportation. It's not all the other things that are happening. It provides access to people on their journey, and we're starting to look at this from a destination management perspective. So you are going from one point to another point, and you have a variety of choices in that journey. So it could be a car, a train, a bus, a bike. Today, those pieces of data in some situations are coming together to provide you that holistic, optimized, both in terms of time and price. But that's what cities will kind of move towards. The relationship between you and your car will also, I think, profoundly change. Not only in terms of the interaction between you and the car, but also the interaction between the car and other cars, and the car and its environment. So obviously, the autonomous driving and all those discussions, but also in terms of the safety issues and the information that you can get in there. At this point, it's not about whether you can see Facebook in your car or whether you can do your email in the car, which is patently stupid. But I think just the mobile phone and then the other devices, and it's all about the data. It is all about the data. It's the information that's collected. It's the person that's staying in a city where it's snowing and has to walk 2 blocks to the bus station, can look up before they go out that bus, for whatever reason, is going to be 16 minutes late. And so you get there 2 minutes before that as opposed to 16 minutes, and you're sitting around. I mean, those are pretty profound changes on people's lives. And that's possible through mobile apps and so on.
And David, your view of the city of the future, it sounds like they're basically becoming intelligent.
Right. I think it's that people can make decisions that for somebody to travel, they're not going to decide what mode they're going to take well ahead of when they decide where they're going to go. We're not going to have so many people saying, I drive everywhere, I'm a bike rider who always bikes somewhere, I'm a bus person and every time I go somewhere I'm taking the bus. Rather, someone's going to go out their door, think, okay, I'm going to neighborhood so-and-so, how should I get there? Telephone, tell me how I should get there. And then it will say, right now, your best bet is to walk 2 blocks over here and catch that bus, which is you're just going to make it, and then it'll get there, and then you do whatever. And it'll be able to guide you in real time how to get there and by what mode. It'll sort of be like the GPSs of today when you're driving, that it says, go down here, take a right, whatever. But instead of it just being a driving GPS, it'll be a multimodal bike, take a car share, walk, take the bus sort of routing system.
We could go on talking for much longer, but I want to open it up so that everybody gets a chance to ask some questions. So if you could just raise your hands if you have something to ask, we'll get a microphone to you. So just wait until that comes. We've got a few start over here. Just 1 second, we'll just get the mic. Yeah, because we're recording this as well, so it gives us good sound quality.
How, cities made up of many different economic structures, that people at different economic levels. I'm from New York. How deep is this technology going to go so that people who don't make a lot of money, who live in different parts of the city, who may not have access to the Starbucks of the world, or don't spend time there, how is this going to work? How are we making it available to them? And have you done much work as far as how deep the adoption rate goes and how we get these people to take advantage of all the opportunities?
Thank you.
I can take a stab at that. There are a number of ways. One is that mobile technology penetration is not particularly at the top of the income spectrum compared to a lot of technologies. Certainly, people with less money are less likely to have a fancy phone than people with more money. But given that phones are becoming smartphones are becoming so widespread and low cost, a lot more people are having them than a lot of technologies we've seen in the past. And that means that in lower income neighborhoods, some of these mobile technologies are more useful for things like, for example, in a lot of poor and or minority neighborhoods, you can't really get a taxi, but you can call, a lot of people are finding that Uber is very useful because it will come, or Car2Go is very useful because since you pick up the cars on some curb and drive them somewhere else in the city and then drop it off, it doesn't care what you look like or where in the city that was that you're taking the car. And there are certainly also people who don't have access to those technologies, and that's, I think, where things like this come in. Cities should invest in having digital displays and information on the bus shelters, at the shops, in whatever places people are going, so that they don't necessarily have to have a phone.
Is there a risk that this becomes very much about the monetization, though, and you can sell this information to the higher bidders, so you're going to get the richer people who can afford to buy information on where the parking spaces are and things?
Well, you may sell it to a company such as Google or somebody else, but I think access to data through mobile phones, and I agree with the comment that it is very ubiquitous. And you can certainly, smartphones, the definition of smartphones is not just an iPhone or an Android phone. It actually goes pretty deep. And you can even push this information out to kind of just plain old feature phones if you needed to. So I think that's more of a positive thing, I think, at this point then.
Thank you. Another question? Gentleman down here at the front.
The kind of services you both are talking about is really innovative and important and useful, but it really is applicable, valuable only to the dense cities of our country, and that's maybe, I'll say 20% of the population or so. But where it would really be valuable would be in the city, much more so would be in Europe and Asia, where there's a lot more dense urbanization. How much of this kind of activity and these apps and these information systems are being, and innovative companies are being developed there, and why aren't you thinking about those other places?
So a very good question, and I will answer this in a couple of different ways. So you're absolutely right. By the way, urbanization is reaching all-time levels. There are more people now living in cities than there were before. And that's certainly happening in the US. It's happening in a much more accelerated way in Asia and in Latin America and so on. Cars are still, the growth in car ownership is skyrocketing. We have deployed now in Manchester, in the UK, in Birmingham. We're going to announce our first deal in France. We've done something in Germany. So we're certainly going out in Europe. And in Europe, the problem is even more acute because these are older cities, the roads are narrower, you just can't, the space is not there. And this is an information problem, it's not a space problem, if you will. There was 2 parking spots in Boston about 5 weeks ago that sold for $600,000. There was a parking spot in New York City in the summer that sold for $1 million. The going rate for parking spots in Hong Kong is 750,000 Hong Kong dollars. And what's happening in India is even more interesting, where when people used to have cars and they were expensive, they also used to have drivers. And so when you go to the market, you go to work, the big boss would kind of walk out and the driver, the poor guy, would kind of drive around and find a spot or go wherever. Now the cars are getting cheaper. The nano car is $2,000. And so it's an up purchase from the person buying a motorbike, to now buying a $2,000 car. But those cities are completely unprepared for the issues related to parking. Now, we can't help them on that from our technology, but I can tell you, this topic of parking is going to become a global, massive issue. I was in Sao Paulo a week ago, 2 hours of traffic, and what people didn't underestimate is that traffic is when the cars get into the cities, they're just freaking driving around because they have no place to park. So the issue of real estate skyrocketing, car ownership is a much bigger problem in emerging economies in Europe, and certainly in the larger cities in the US, but also the smaller towns where there's a concentration of issues, whether it's downtown Aspen or Palo Alto and so on.
Yeah. I definitely agree with your sort of comment about there being enormous value for these things in Asia and Europe and so forth. I actually want to slightly disagree with the initial premise that these things are only useful for the people who actually live in cities. I think that, first of all, I mean, I talked about some city examples, maybe because I live in a city, but there are a lot of people in suburbs who now actually are taking the bus more and more, partly because bus service is improving and partly because of the suburbanization of poverty, that more and more people of lower incomes are living in suburbs. That's one factor. Also, people still make mode choices if they live in a suburb. For example, they might drive to a metro station and use Zia's own technology to find out whether they have room to park at that station. And if it's full, maybe they'll go to a different one. So that can still be valuable for people, even if they have to start their trip with a car. But most of all, most Americans, even if they don't live in center cities, live in metropolitan areas, and therefore they go to the cities a fair amount. Even people who live in rural areas go to cities. And it's the person who's visiting any city for the first time or who's not very familiar with it that most would benefit from an app that tells you which bus to take. When I was, after I checked into my hotel and then I wanted to come up here, I had found out that the bike share system was launched. And it was, but I didn't know my way around Aspen because I'd never been here, and I knew how bike share systems worked, but I knew that I could go to that station, and I pulled up an app on my phone that showed me, oh, there's a station near my hotel, oh, there's a station up here at the conference, so now I know that I can use this system that I'm unfamiliar with. And that is one of the best values of all this technology, is helping people with the very unfamiliar trips.
So could it actually help with sort of encouraging public transport use as well? I mean, if you make these things easier to use, sure, more people will come, presumably.
Right. I mean, transit can be, buses in particular. I mean, for the people who take the same bus to work every day, fine. It doesn't really matter how windy the route is, how bad the signage. They just know they stand here and so forth. But for the person who is taking an unfamiliar trip, which is a lot of people on transit, we can do an enormous amount to get people to feel like transit is a viable option.
Great. Another question. There's a gentleman at the front here and then a gentleman at the back.
So I'll just follow up a little bit on Dan's comment and push back on a couple of the comments from the panel. Sure. We're not urbanizing in the US. We've had about a third of our population in cities in the 1930s, and we have about a third of the population today. That's not changed. What has changed is the suburb growth from that same period of time went from about 5% to about 50%. So, 70% of Americans don't live in cities, and the point about suburbs going to the downtown area, we looked at Denver close by. Only a third of all the metro trips in Metro Denver either started or ended in the city. So a lot of people drive through the city because that's the highway, but not as many as you may think actually use the city. And I guess I'm just concerned because the answers I just heard were basically, let's use IT to make city solutions slightly more convenient in the suburbs, but that really hasn't had the kind of impact that I think we all would like to think it would. So I guess I'd just push the panel to think a little bit more about the other 70% of America. And I mean, there's still huge opportunities to optimize, to reduce, CO2 footprints, to reduce car dependence. And, simply saying, oh, this app is going to make taking the bus or the train more convenient. That only works if you're going to the city.
Sure. So I can answer that in terms of the work that we do on parking. Now, that obviously involves a car, and it involves areas there where there's an issue around parking. And that, by definition, is on one hand, the larger cities. Okay, and I can tell you, in those larger cities, the demand for or the frustration around parking and congestion is going up. That's because there are more cars on the street that are looking for that spot. And I can provide you the data and information on that because there's a demand. So that's on parking. And then there are what you would consider kind of the mid-sized towns or even small places is Sausalito in California. We just deployed in 3 smaller cities, Redwood City, San Mateo, and San Carlos in California as well, Fort Lauderdale, Jacksonville, Howard County near Maryland. In those places, you don't need our sensors in the whole legal city area, but you need it in those 15, 20 blocks that are in the center. So, I mean, they can comment on the other modes of transportation, but on parking, this is becoming a bigger issue in cities and in urban metropolitan areas or downtown business districts, however you want to define it. And there's plenty of data to support that. Now, whether that's, I'm not an expert on kind of town planning and so on, whether that's people coming in from the suburbs and so on and so forth. But on the parking front, it's becoming a huge problem.
So kind of a case of start with the low-hanging fruit, attack cities first. Because
yeah, and we're for example, we're getting involved in a lot of universities. Right. I mean, I teach at Stanford University on the side. I mean, Stanford, Oregon State. We just are deploying in University of Pennsylvania, Clemson. I mean, going into a university campus, it's like a small town, and for a visitor or somebody. So and we're now starting to deploy on campuses as well. And I can't say it probably. We're on several corporate campuses where the company is looking to provide a different level of service to their visitors coming there. So it's all about, you have a car, you have to park it. What can we do to make that experience as painless and quick as possible?
And I mean, on the broad question, maybe 2 points. I mean, one is, yes, IT is not going to solve every problem. The best way to get people to have options other than the automobile in suburbs is not to give them better apps, but to give them better other travel choices like better bus service and better bicycle routes and whatever else they might need in different places as appropriate. But we're in a panel talking about technology, so we're talking about how technology can help people maximize the value of the investment that a city is making. The city puts a bus route in, and a lot of our bus routes in our region at least are in the suburbs. And if people aren't going to ride them because they don't go where they want, then that's a big capital expense to fix, and maybe it's one that's worth making. If they're not going to ride it because they don't know about it, or because the city can only afford to make it come every 30 minutes, and so you never feel comfortable going outside to wait for the bus because it'll take so long, technology could help get more out of it. So it's just maybe wringing a little bit more out of what we have. I'd also I guess the other question is, when you talk about the city statistic, and I guess what Zia was talking about, how are we defining a city? I don't know exactly for the stat you're citing, but in our region, there are a lot of suburbs that are getting urban, or there are small towns like the ones you were talking about that are walkable. I mean, here, we have a bike share system. There are at least 3 bus routes. You can walk most places. So I had at least 4 choices of how to get from my hotel to here. And so I would consider this to be as much city in the respect of what we're talking about as Washington. It's just a very much smaller version, but it's walkable, it's got transit, it's got bike. I mean, there's no reason it's different. So when we say city, it's really more like a place like Aspen versus a place like where it's really just houses all on 2 acres and there's really no other way to get around. And those areas, we should give people more options too, but there are a lot of places that are not just cities.
Okay, we can take another question. The gentleman at the back, did you have one?
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask about college campuses, but you kind of answered that question. I was just wondering how much you're putting out with bike shares and programs like that on college campuses, and how well they're being received.
The next generation.
Right. I mean, some other people here in the audience, like Gabe and Summer doing the panel yesterday, who might be able to give you better specific examples of college campus bike shares, because that's not something that I can tell you in as much detail. But I know that it has been a very popular thing to add on a lot of college campuses, has been very popular, and college campuses have, in many ways, the best built-in kind of form for a lot of things with bike share. A lot of campuses are somewhat spread out, and sometimes people have to go, a lot of campuses have like a science area that's a little bit away from the rest. And historically, people would have their own bikes, and that's a great way to go. And bike share isn't going to replace that, but bike share can be very valuable as a supplement to existing biking or as a supplement to existing shuttle bus service, because the shuttle bus runs on a fixed schedule, and your own bike you have to take 2 ways, and sometimes you want to take those modes, but when you have a bike share, that gives you sort of another choice if you only want to go one way, or you're going off hours or something like that.
A couple of questions down here at the front. Gentleman in white first. Just one second. Let's get the microphone to you. There you go.
I have a question, but anecdotally, I have two daughters who live in D.C.
Great.
One of them lived 4 years here in Aspen, and now they've sworn off cars for the reasons you're referring. And interestingly enough, they'll ultimately head back to Denver, which is becoming more conducive to everything you're talking about. Question, you were talking about streaming data from bike share programs, trip data. I could see why the municipalities would have interest, but what commercial enterprise would want to use that data, and what possible applications could you imagine?
That's a great question. Well, actually, this screen was built, this prototype was built through a sort of government-granted program, but then the people who built this screen are now doing a company to make more of these and sell them to, especially in our area, business improvement districts who want people to be able to come by bus and know that they can, that the bus is a good option. So they feel like if there's one of these in some shop window all along the street, then people will say, oh, the bus is a good way to get to and from Georgetown, for example, in DC, and then they'll take the bus more, which that area wants to really encourage because it's hard to park. So they want more people to be able to come by bus. So that's one example. People are making apps, all these mobile apps that are that they're maybe selling. Maybe they're not selling them for a lot of money. Maybe they're selling them for 99 cents or $1.99 on the App Store. So, if they had to negotiate with the general counsel of, in particular, like 6 different bus systems, and even if those general counsels all just wanted them to sign some kind of complex agreement and pay no money, it would take so long to do that it would deter a lot of people from just whipping up a $1.99 app. But with the data available, they can just throw the app together, make some money, not a huge amount, but enough to maybe pay for a little bit of extra whatever.
There was another question in the front. Yep.
Yeah, I'm from Washington, D.C., and I appreciate all you're doing. And it would be
you.
great if you had the parking app, the parking.
It's on its way.
So, how easy or difficult is the sale to a municipality? What are the soft spots? It sounds like a great idea, but it's not mindless. It must be difficult.
Yeah, I think it's so. In the 3 years that I've been there, I've honestly never had a single conversation where somebody said not interested. This doesn't work, and so on. Streetline has been kind of a pioneer in this space. So, 3 years ago, it was about, well, what does a sensor do? The industry and the people in that industry were not used to looking at APIs and apps and data and information. So we had to kind of start with the basics there. So there was a learning piece of the puzzle that needed to be done. Now, honestly, it's a matter of the process of acquiring new technology. It's a process issue. It's not an economics issue. I would today happily go do a rev share with the city because we've proven over and over again that the economic ROI on installing our system is 3 to 4 months for a city. So the ROI is very, very significant. And it's public, so I'll say it. We charge typically about $250 upfront per space, and then about $20 per month per space. And the $250 upfront covers everything. It's the sensors, it's the network equipment, it's the installation, which Siemens does for us. And then the $20 per month is the entire maintenance of the network, the physical network, and all the apps. There isn't a single other, there's no hidden other piece of the puzzle. And so if you look at the economics of a parking spot, can you generate in a month more than $20 that covers the cost of that? The answer is yes, based on the earlier point I made about the money that you pay to the meter. By using our app, you increase the rotation of cars going out there. Dynamic pricing is changing that as you start thinking about varying pricing. And then there's the enforcement piece of it as well. I mean, we also look at the enforcement side and assist the enforcement officers on getting to the spot where there's a violation. So it's not an economic issue. In the last year, there's been, honestly, an explosion of RFPs. We're working on multiple RFPs of large cities in the US. So it's become mainstream. So there is, for a startup, it's a little tough because, the financial economics of it, but that's why we have our ecosystem of partners. And I think the good news is that once you are engaged with the city, then you're usually engaged for a long time. And that's the upside of it. And so it's a balancing act. It's a hard thing to do, But because it's hard, honestly, from a competitive perspective, it's tougher for somebody else to come in and do it. And that's why I went into parking because of the revenue piece of it, because of otherwise it's difficult to sell a city on, well, this will save the environment, which is a great argument, no doubt about it, but it's a tougher sell.
We have just a couple of minutes left. Should we take another question from the gentleman?
Yes. I'm going to put a different twist on some of this data, in the sense that if you think about it from a real estate development perspective and think about a large shopping center, the information regarding ease of parking is important. But it's important from the standpoint of the owners, operators within that shopping center, and they don't want all their potential customers to know that it's going to be a bitch to park in their lot on Saturday afternoon. So it really, is there a way of limiting the geographic range of availability of information so that it's only when they get 200 yards away from the entrance to the shopping center that they can find out where in this center of 5,000 spaces are spaces available?
Very good question. Let me completely flip it on its head to give you two different answers to that. One is there are companies that are trying to make available on weekends, for example, spaces that are in commercial areas. Your local Citibank parking lot, which is not being used on the weekend. Other businesses where the parking lot, you can go reserve in those spaces and go park in those spaces. So that's one answer. The other answer is pricing. So that shopping mall, would you pay, or certain people would pay, $5 to park in that front spot in front of that Macy's. So some shopping malls are doing it, and people are paying for it. Because you're going to go spend the $300-400. Other people may not. They may go to the top of it, they may not get there. But in our view, it's an information gap. Are you going to get more people in when you tell them that there's parking on the 6th floor and there's 3 spots, and you're going to drive all the way up to the 6th floor and you'll actually find the 3 spots? So I think there's ways to manage that. It's never been true that holding back information will help you. I think merchants, at least the ones that we've spoken to, want to include parking as part of their service. They just haven't had a way to do it till now.
We have 2 minutes, so we can take one more question if we have another one. Anybody wants to say something? Lady at the back here.
Very quick. Have you noticed that with the increase of technology that there is an increase in socioeconomic levels using public transportation by making it more convenient and more conducive, perhaps in the metro area of DC?
Absolutely. Our system, we have a little bit of a different dynamic than many cities in that the metro system in particular, the train has always been a higher socioeconomic transit mode, and certain bus lines always have. So there wasn't, in some cities, there's a really strong feeling of like transit is for poor people, and some car industry advertising has even often reinforced that type of an idea. We are a little bit, it's a little bit different, but what we have definitely found is that technology kind of empowers different groups. It empowers some groups of more affluent people who wouldn't take a bus, and now they will. And like we were talking about a little bit earlier, it also empowers a lot of lower income people who find actually that some of these new options are even better for them than some of the old options. So it's kind of having a strengthening effect across the board.
All right, we could go on for much longer, but I think we have to leave it there. Thank you very much. So David, thank you. Check out Greater Washington. Thank you, Zia. Check out Parker. Thank you.